After episode 21, Digimon Adventure started heading into a new story arc, but not in a good way. Now, while one may find it appropriate to lump episodes 22 through 26 within the Vamdemon Invasion arc, I beg to differ if only for the sake of quality. What we're entering into here is a zone of sloppy writing and a game of catch-up. After the completion of Taichi's arc, one gets the feeling that the writers had to give all the other children the equivalent of an MMO character booster. That way they could all endure future expansions without too much hustle. There exist many bizarre writing choices, some of which are minor and easily brushed aside, while others cross the line into absolute ridiculousness. Now, the show as a whole is not ruined by any of this, but these episodes nevertheless leave one wanting something better overall. Episode 22 begins where episode 21 left off. Taichi has returned, and he finds himself back amidst the desert of the Server Continent. There's nothing to it but to search for his friends. Now, in Taichi's absence, we'll find out that the rest of the chosen children had split up. While this is meant to show the effect that Taichi's absence has had, one must remember, the characters are still children. Separation would not at all be realistic, considering just how young the characters are, and just how much they've relied on each other for sustenance and protection, and more. However, we must also grant the existence of Pico Devimon, who outright tricks Joe into getting lost. What's also implied here is that Pico Devimon had a hand in causing everyone else to become separated as well. Sadly, however, we are never actually shown those details. There's also dialogue from Sora that makes the situation sound like the separation happened naturally, and that Pico Devimon was not as responsible as he is made out to be. In which case, another story idea could have been to invent another Sora, a clone from Nanomon's lab, and she would incur some shenanigans amidst the group. That is all in hindsight, however. I prefer my stories to be a bit more complicated. Granted, playing things out differently than what the show turned out may have required many more episodes. Episodes that would flesh out the kind of drama that ensued in Taichi's absence. What a shame we got so very little. For such details would have done wonders to build up the other characters. Characters who very desperately needed the opportunity to shine. Like Sora. Instead, Sora's situation is, well, it's greatly mishandled, and I'll get around to talking about that very shortly. So by this point in the show, the children are vaguely aware that the crests they've found correspond to personality traits. Specifically, these are courage, friendship, love, sincerity, knowledge, reliability, hope, kindness, and light. Yes, apparently even light is a trait. So the onus for each child is for them to demonstrate their capacity to exemplify a trait that corresponds with their crest. Taichi, for instance, displayed his courage, and therefore Agumon achieved his perfect evolution. Yet, when one proceeds down the line of each trait, one may ask whether or not many, if not all of them, are mutually exclusive. For example, love and friendship are similar enough that one wonders why they were not turned into one particular crest. And these redundancies within the crests will also require super-specific situations be enacted before they become realized. What this means is that the writers have to lay out very elaborate situations that require, metaphorically speaking, very appropriately shaped pegs be fit into their respective holes. Another detail is that the achievement is a one-and-done deal. In other words, as soon as the child learns whatever lessons he or she needs to learn, the evolution is thereby unlocked. Afterwards, the evolution just becomes another facet, and goes back to a simple basis of food and rest. Now, the problem with all of this is that the crests are based on the limited understanding of humanity by the one who created the crests, homeostasis. You see, homeostasis is a computer, and it only understands humanity from a technical standpoint. At Odaiba, watching Taichi and Hikari interact with Agumon in such a manner as would allow Agumon to evolve into Greymon, homeostasis then gained a very limited amount of information, upon which it would later create a means of connecting Digimon with humans. And those means were realized in the form of the Digivices and the crests. The fact that the crests are made so specifically is a problem because there's no way homeostasis would have the capacity to begin to understand those facets. What I mean is that the Digivices and the crests should have been designed as a means of learning about humanity on the go. And as the children display whatever tendencies they displayed back in Odaiba, then at that point they become more specific. This would make the crests far more personal to each child, and might also ensure that if some Digimon like Nanomon were to clone Sora, that clone would not be able to use Sora's crest because the real Sora would still be a unique individual. Anyway, enough of that tangent. Let's get into episode 22, as painful a prospect as that will turn out to be. Now, if the oddity of having all the children separate was not enough, the writers actually had the audacity to have Yamato leave Takeru to go investigate something. Now, not only is this situation entirely forced, there's more than enough room on that boat for Takeru and the tiny Tokomon, but everything we know about Yamato would tell us that only God himself could separate him from his younger brother. Now, of course, the reason the writers made this happen was so that Takeru could be left to the vices of Pico Devimon. Drama must be induced. Pico Devimon will then try to convince Takeru that Yamato doesn't care about him anymore. Now here one must consider there's any number of ways one could have separated the two brothers by force. But what the writers were keen on doing here was to pivot the separation on Yamato's becoming continually frustrated with Takeru. And therefore that gives Pico Devimon something to exploit. Now here's the problem. There's no getting around the fact that this entire situation makes Yamato look extremely irresponsible. And that will also be compounded by all the things we learn in the next episode. Now here's another problem with this episode. Why is Tokomon still Tokomon? Why hasn't he evolved? Remember, it's been months since Taichi's disappearance, and in all that time, Tokomon has not evolved. That's just silly. But this and other events occurring within this episode are written in such a way as would make one assume that Taichi was gone for only a couple of days. Anyway, Yamato leaves Takeru behind, and while Takeru and Tokomon wait for his return, they encounter the mischievous Pico Devimon, who starts in on his deceptions, insisting that Yamato abandoned them. Now, why would Takeru have any reason to believe this strange Digimon he just met, especially one whose name also happens to be derived from Devimon? Granted, the English dub tries to amend this by editing the dialogue a bit, but it's still not enough to warrant that Takeru actually buy into the bait. Perhaps we're to assume that Pico Devimon's very voice has some subliminal influence. He is a devil after all. Well, following Pico Devimon's deception, Takeru and Tokomon start an argument that ends with Takeru tossing his Digivice, tag, and crest and leaving. What a reaction! This is the Digimon partner he's been with and relied upon over the course of their adventures throughout the digital world, and moreover Tokomon is also Angemon, the one who sacrificed himself to Devimon to save his friends from certain doom. Why would Takeru do this? The childlike tone of Digimon Adventure is really starting to show its true colors. Pico Devimon has Takeru all to himself. Yet, instead of choosing to end things right then and there, Pico Devimon takes Takeru for rides around a theme park. Admittedly, a theme is playing out here, which could also be taken as an excuse for the poor writing. Pico Devimon is a small devil whispering into the ears of these children, tempting them away from their assigned destinies as protectors of the digital world. The problem, however, is that none of this happens organically. We're left scratching our heads. Now, thankfully, Taichi's Digivice leads him directly to Takeru's location, and the pair have a very sweet reunion. Sadly, this will constitute the only heartfelt reunion Taichi will have among the others, when he rejoins them in the future. This is the only highlight of the entire episode. Takeru runs up and embraces Taichi. There are tears in his eyes, revealing just how strong a bond that he and Taichi had established during the time they spent together in the digital world. Takeru then reveals something to Taichi that has only been hinted at thus far, that Yamato actively resented Taichi for how well Taichi and Takeru got along with each other. Now Taichi protests this at first, but Takeru insists, thereby leaving Taichi speechless. And while this is very insightful, the writers don't do us the courtesy of ever following up on this. It's one of many missed opportunities the writers had to unravel our characters. Now during this reunion, Pico Devimon happens across a very specific plot device, introduced in this episode alone, and never again being referred to or even used in any other episode. There just so happens to be these magic mushrooms that cause amnesia to whomever eats them. Conveniently, Pico Devimon is made aware of what they do when two Gazimon, former Edamon lackeys, decide to start eating them. And here we get another instance of the dialogue reflecting past events, as if they were just days recent and not months ago, since the Gazimon refer to Edamon as if they only recently left his employ. And like I said, this is all very plot-specific stuff. The dialogue very pointedly conveys the very specific information about the side effects of these amnesia-inducing mushrooms, which Pico Devimon will then attempt to feed to the children and their Digimon partners. Fortunately, the children don't fall for it, mostly because Taichi decides they need to be cooked. And then, for whatever reason, Agumon decides he needs to wash his hands or claws. And, what a miraculous circumstance. Agumon suddenly decides to become extremely hygienic. In hindsight, the writers should have written a scene in the previous episode where, after Koromon was done eating his food, Hikari takes him over to the sink and helps him wash his hands, or whatever those things are on the top of his head. There you have some establishment for future things that Agumon does, like this instance here. And then he's spoken to by some mysterious benefactor, who, in truth, is Sora. Somehow she knew the mushrooms were poisonous, but for reasons that will be explained later, Sora doesn't choose to reveal herself here. I'll get to that later on. Now the episode ends with a Tokamon evolution, finally, and Pico Devimon is made to pay for his failures at the hands of a new threat, one whose identity is not revealed to us at this point in time. Meanwhile, Taichi and Takira resolve to find Yamato and everyone else. And so we head into episode 23. Where the writers came up with a very outlandish way to activate Yamato's crest. In this situation, the owners of a local restaurant are holding Joe and Yamato captive and forcing them to do chores for all eternity. And yes, that is exactly what happens, and it is as stupid as it sounds. Joe decided to grab a bite to eat at some restaurant, only to find that he couldn't pay for his meal because the owner, Digitamamon, only deals in American dollars. So does this mean the US Federal Reserve has extended its reach as far as the digital world now? Does the digital world have some kind of central banking system we're not made aware of? Do Digimon regularly carry wads of cash around with them? Can they use credit cards instead? How does all this work?
なんだこりゃ。なんだこりゃ。なんだこりゃ。
Now the point I'm making here is that this is all very silly. Compounded by the fact that Yamato has prioritized helping Joe in this instance, rather than going back to retrieve his younger brother first. Joe's life was not in any danger after all, so why wouldn't Yamato have come back later? But as I said, what all this leads up to is a super specific situation where Garurumon can achieve his perfect evolution. Now one must compare Yamato's circumstances to Taichi's rescuing Sora, followed by Taichi's defeating a dark network-infused Edamon. Taichi and Agumon ended the tyranny of a Digimon who controlled a vast portion of the server continent and very nearly wiped out the chosen children. Meanwhile, Yamato and Gabumon were simply placed within an uncomfortable situation, nowhere near life or death. And then Yamato will initiate a fight with a pissed-off restaurant manager who forced him and Joe to wash dishes and prepare food for customers. God forbid. All the events that lead to Gabumon's evolution are also ridiculous. The way the situation goes is Pico Devimon somehow convinces Yamato that Joe is dead weight. And that's all despite the fact that Joe has, on occasion, proved himself. Nevertheless, due Pico Devimon's words, Yamato immediately and openly resents Joe. And then Yamato suddenly realizes, Joe was my friend all along. And that in turn causes Garurumon to evolve. And that's it. That's the trigger. The crest of friendship triggers when Yamato realizes that he's friends with somebody. When you put it like that, you start to think to yourself, wow, these crests, they're kind of silly. Attributes like courage, friendship, love, etc., they're not supposed to be one-time gestures. These are facets that are integral to what makes us human and separates us from the creatures around us. And what that should mean is that Yamato's crest should have been activated at the brink of his simply engaging in what he had always engaged in, simply being a friend to others. Instead, the way the episode is illustrated, Yamato is made to learn a life lesson, and that triggers the evolution. Although in hindsight, the life lesson seems to be not to fall for being tricked, but we'll grant that it's not really what the writers had intended in this instance. The difference in illustration that I'm talking about here is the difference in telling a story and preaching a message to one's audience. The latter has been chosen in this case. That's why the situation feels so forced. For all intents and purposes, it was forced. And just so we're being fair, Agumon's evolution was triggered in the same manner. Other commenters have pointed this out to me, and I must concede that while the final fight with Edamon is spectacular, it does come off the cuff of Taichi having learned a life lesson about courage. Courage that, by all means, he had already been displaying. Perhaps one can better justify Taichi's behavior in that the circumstances there were far direr, or that he was also coping with guilt over the fact that he was partially responsible for Sora's kidnapping. Regardless, here's the elaboration for Yamato's life lesson. Takeru is conveniently imperiled by a vegetable Digimon whose main attack also happens to be throwing poop. Now Joe goes to save Takeru, but winds up becoming the victim himself, getting his life squeezed out of him by Vegemon, while Yamato simply stares at him for a good long while without actually doing anything helpful. Here are we led to believe that Yamato would never have realized that Joe is his friend unless all this happened to coincide? Would he have otherwise simply sat there and watched Joe get squeezed to death? And here's also where the concepts of the crests begin to intermingle. What Yamato could have done in this instance is lunged at Vegemon in an attempt to pry him off of Joe, his friend. And the entire gesture would have been visually appropriate. He would have done that because he wants to save his friend. However, this would also make his gesture look similar to that of Taichi's own actions, against the likes of Shellmon, for instance. And so there's my theory on these elaborate crest activation situations. The writers needed a higher degree of specificity in each situation as would hit the mark exactly for each respective child. So Yamato needs to realize Joe was his friend, but he can't do anything courageous because that trait is specific to Taichi. Hopefully here you can see my logic behind having the crests be far more personal to the children, and applying any number of traits they aspire to rather than one specific trait in particular. Now, earlier I also took note about how Takeru was so happy to see Taichi, and he ran over to him and hugged him, tears in his eyes. That was a wonderful moment. A happy reunion was warranted. Compare this to the instance where Taichi reunites with Yamato and Joe, and one cannot deny that it is lackluster. Nothing of significance happens here. In fact, Yamato seemed far happier to see Taichi after their brief separation from Devimon back on File Island. But here, after Taichi's been gone for months and even assumed to be dead, Yamato barely registers that Taichi is even there. Another detail to address here is why Agumon would not have otherwise evolved. Well, because the episode was dedicated to a Garurumon perfect evolution, the writers therefore needed to take Taichi out of the picture temporarily. So they do just that. While everyone else is set to fight a perfect level Digimon, Taichi, the only child whose Digimon has achieved perfect evolution at this point in time, elects to chase after Pico Devimon. And at first it appears Taichi runs quite a distance from the fight, but later we see him standing next to Yamato as where Garurumon is fighting Digitamamon. Meanwhile, during this entire stint, Agumon has yet to evolve. So the writers conveniently put Taichi away for a few seconds just so he couldn't steal the spotlight from Yamato. It's as simple as that. Moreover, based on the events of episode 36 sometime in the future, Gomamon should also have achieved a perfect evolution here. You see, in episode 36, Takeru will land himself in grave danger, and Joe yet again takes it upon himself to save him in that situation. The only difference in the circumstances is that Joe specifically makes a promise to Takeru's mother that he'll keep him safe. Otherwise, both situations are identical. Takeru is in danger, and Joe places himself in harm's way to save him. And here in this episode, Taichi will even remark that Joe was uncharacteristically selfless. Again, this has to do with the specificity of the gesture coinciding with the situation. It's extremely ridiculous. Overall, episode 23 heavily disservices Yamato, and the writing just continues to poke holes in the entire conception of the tags and crests. If not the worst episode, episode 23 is one of the worst, which is a real shame given the amount of import the show puts on Yamato. By all means, Yamato deserved a more worthwhile and well-established villain to fight, not one so forced and hastily established as this angry restaurant manager. Unfortunately, however, the writers do not stop with Yamato here. The same kind of thing will happen with Koshiro in the very next episode. Albeit all the facets of the writing are not executed as poorly as episode 23, but still very poorly executed nevertheless. Now, along the same lines of my commentary about the mushrooms of forgetfulness in episode 22, there's yet another act of convenience that occurs in episode 24. So, Koshiro is captured by Vadermon, A Digimon who looks like something that you'd see out of a classic science fiction space invader film. Get it? Vadermon. Invader. Anyway, Koshiro, as we've established, is smart, so his crest naturally corresponds to his intellect. However, as has been the case so far, the writers needed to enact some kind of super specific gesture or life lesson before a perfect evolution could be unlocked. Roger that, so one then supposes the best manner of activating Koshiro's crest would be to get him to do something super smart. Right. But that won't be the case here. Instead, what the writers are going to resort to here is a very elaborate life lesson. And they're going to force that into the narrative literally. What this means is that Koshiro is going to have some part of his mind removed temporarily, in a manner corresponding with people not appreciating what they have until they no longer have it. So Vadermon removes a physical substance that amounts to Koshiro's curiosity. And now you see why I correlate this with the magic mushrooms. This is for this episode only type of thing. And why I say this is elaborate is that this is written as to what will be required to activate Koshiro's crest. Beyond all that, the writers never really explain how Vadermon removes curiosity bubbles from people in the first place. One supposes the ability is just something specific to him. Now, I suppose I would not so readily criticize this stuff on the same level as I would in Yamato's case, because Koshiro's little journey here plays off as what a fable. And to Digimon Adventure, I've already made comparisons to the tale of Urashimataro. So, to be fair, I suppose one could take it for granted that Koshiro has entered a realm where he gets to live out a parable. Now, it's here in this episode that we're also allowed to see how Koshiro made contact with Taichi. Well, Taichi was in the real world. But the dialogue differs greatly from what we saw in episode 21. As far as the time lapse is concerned, the situation also begs the question just how long Koshiro has been floating around in Vadermon's realm, and how is he able to survive for that long without food or water? And here one may suppose Vadermon's realm is even further disconnected from space and time. Perhaps it's interstitial. Nothing is made clear, however, and so while a quick headcanon can invent answers to this, the writing itself withholds its own. Here I'll refer to Occam's razor and assume the writers simply forgot about those details. One final thing of note. Vadermon is willing to bargain with Pico Devimon for Koshiro's crest in exchange for a huge pile of poop. The writers even make it a point to have Vadermon's mouth begin to water at the prospect. Now that would lead one to believe that Vadermon eats poop. Perhaps they were playing it off as some kind of childish joke. If so, it was in very poor taste. No pun intended. And this was changed in the English dub, which indeed makes it come across as far less odd, but nevertheless, what exactly were the Japanese writers going for here?
Why would you do that, dude?
Because poop is funny.
Moving on to episode 25, the villain to be defeated in this episode is the ability to sing karaoke. I wish I was joking about that, but there we have it. So, similar to how episode 23 was just begging the question, why didn't Yamato and Joe just ditch the restaurant? You know, because they had far more important obligations to attend to, like saving the digital world, maybe? Well, episode 25 will include a scene where Taichi and Joe allow themselves to be thrown into a dungeon without a struggle, all because Mimi is acting like a spoiled brat. So what we learn here is that Mimi had offered to help a kingdom of amphibious Digimon wake up their king, Tano-sama Gekomon, with her singing. And Mimi is apparently a very good singer, which I cannot help but think should have been featured more throughout the show. Mimi singing a song to brighten the day and raise spirits as the children collectively continued on their adventures would contrast greatly on this particular occasion where Mimi withholds her voice. Due all the luxuries piled upon her by the amphibians, Mimi is incentivized not to follow through with her promises, and she furthermore forced the kingdom's residents to serve her hand and foot as she procrastinates. Now, if one takes the entire situation at face value, one would assume this was all leading to Palmon's perfect evolution. Here, Mimi would realize just how selfish she had been, and then she would apologize for her behavior. And reconciliation with the amphibians and her friends would then allow Lilymon to appear and set things right when Tano-sama Gekomon awakens. However, things do not occur as simply as all that. What does happen is that Mimi throws Taichi and Joe in prison, like I said, and once again no respect is shown to Taichi having cheated death and made this sudden comeback. Moreover, Taichi and Joe seem to have forgotten that in this moment, Agumon and Gomamon could still evolve and break them out of prison, yet they put up zero resistance when Mimi has them arrested. There again, I guess the plot needed that to happen so that Mimi would learn a lesson here. And yes, later on Mimi does learn a life lesson. This happens after a nightmare piques her conscience, and then Sora arrives to set her straight. And I suppose it's fortunate that Mimi had that nightmare and Sora happened to be there at the same time to use that as a point to reset Mimi's priorities. Unless we're otherwise led to believe that Sora was just stalking everyone and hoping to jump in on any situation where she could just set things right without revealing herself. But as I've said, the writing here is pretty abysmal. But there's still more mire to dredge. Even though Mimi learns her life lesson and frees her friends, and then awakens Tano-sama Gekkomon, she is denied a crowning moment of awesome, and Metal Greymon saves the day instead. And so a Togemon evolution will be reserved for the Vamdemon invasion arc, alongside one for Ikakumon at the Rainbow Bridge in Odaiba. Funny to consider here is the fact that the amphibians will later aid Mimi and the others in the final arc of the show against Paimon's forces, because on this occasion, all Mimi did was cause them trouble. So finally we come to episode 26. This is the least bizarre of the bunch and might not even be worth lumping together with all the rest, except for the presence of one very large elephant in the room. Where has Sora been all this time? During the course of these 5 episodes, Sora has been working undercover. I believe that's the best way to describe it. She's been trying to help her friends, but she does not want to be seen helping them for, reasons. Sora's excuse for essentially remaining invisible to her friends is very ridiculous, and also hinges on information that Pico Devimon should by all means not be aware of. Now first we consider the fact that Pico Devimon has been constantly trying to deceive the children, and Sora has been made well aware of this. Now if she'd just come out and simply said to the others, "Hey, this guy's trouble, don't trust him," that would have put a quick end to all the life or death situations that ensued from Pico Devimon's deceptions. However, the reason Sora kept silent, as she reveals, is because she was upset about the fact that her crest wouldn't glow. Now, of course, that isn't all there is to it. She was upset because she doesn't believe her crest will ever glow, because her trait is one that she believes she will forever be unable to attend to. That trait is love, by the way. Now, this whole drama with Sora started out because Pico Devimon told her that her mother never loved her. What? How does Pico Devimon know anything about Sora's mother? Perhaps he watched one of Sora's flashbacks? Is Pico Devimon capable of breaking the fourth wall?
なんだこりゃ。なんだこりゃ。なんだこりゃ。
Well, regardless, Pico Devimon's words cause Sora to lose confidence in herself and her ability to activate her crest. Therefore, she hides because she is ashamed. But she still tries to help her friends anyway. Just undercover. Well, congratulations, Sora, you played yourself. You never thought you could display love, but you did just that in every instance where you helped your friends. Except Sora's crest doesn't glow in any of those situations. It will glow, however, when she specifically says the words, "I love you," to Piyomon when she's in danger. Because, well, like I said, very specific situations, holes in pegs, yada yada yada. Now, since love is a very generic word that can describe a great many things, we make an attempt to nail down which of these describes Sora's crest. You can have romantic love, platonic love, motherly love, fatherly love, and so many others. Ultimately, one assumes that motherly love is the answer, because the hurdle set up is Sora's need to be reconciled with her mother. There's that and the fact that Piyomon is particularly protective when it comes to Sora and her friends, which is indicative of a motherly affection. So in this case, there's any number of situations where Piyomon could have landed herself in some kind of danger, and that would call for Sora to express her love for her partner and trigger an evolution. Not much more need be said about that. Aside from all these cases where the writing has lost its cohesion, there's not much more worth complaining about in episode 26. We have the next big bad revealed here, a Dracula lookalike named Vamdemon. He has a bat-themed getup going for him, similar to Devimon. And much like Devimon, Vamdemon remains in the shadows and chooses to play his cards close to the chest. Now, however, is the moment he has chosen to strike. Now, when Devimon held back, one would assume that was because of his adult-level status. He was highly cautious and mindful of the limits of his own strengths, and so he chose subterfuge over an out-and-out battle with the children. Vamdemon, on the other hand, is perfect level, and he stokes an ambitious ego of his own, and he'll even forego practicality in order to attend to a very particular aesthetic, something he remarks upon later on in the show. And like every other villain of the show, his vanity will turn out to be his greatest weakness. Vamdemon's assassination attempt ends with a clash with a newly evolved Garudamon. The encounter closes out with the chosen children making a retreat, as Vamdemon conjures a swarm of bats in retaliation to Garudamon's fire. This is one of the coolest looking animations in the show, by the way. Episode 26 closes out soon after that. In summary, episodes 22 through 26 are not the last examples of very odd and poorly written episodes of Digimon Adventure, but they're worth particular note because of how all 5 run in succession with one another, and so stick out like a sore thumb. What the writers seem to be trying to do with the story here is to have Yamato, Sora, and Koshiro play catch-up with Taichi before they all head into the Vamdemon invasion arc and fight more perfect-level Digimon. Overall, the entire project winds up being very poorly handled. But to be frank, the biggest blunder of all is that Taichi's return has little to no impact on the other children. Takeru is the only one who reacts in wonderment and tears. Meanwhile, the other children spent months looking for him, even going so far as to assume he died, and his absence was central to why they split apart. So why such limp reactions to discovering that he was alive? However, what also beleaguers these episodes may also be attributed to the concepts of the crests. And as I said in the beginning, the crests should have been designed more specifically to the uniqueness of each child, and then they activate soon after the children themselves show any kind of evolution of character. They grow in character, and so their Digimon partners grow with them, and that's symbolized by their evolution. Pretty simple, right? In fact, I'll go a bit further and say that the crests should also have been dependent on the collective journey that the chosen children were going on, rather than react upon them individually. And that idea will be strengthened by what's revealed at the end of the show as well, that the crests don't just work because the children themselves act upon the traits respective to the crests, but also because the children collectively embody those traits. In fact, a journey leading to their discovery of their collective strength may have been a far better story avenue to explore after Taichi was taken out of the picture. What the children needed at that point was a new standard of leadership, and so more drama would have ensued, but in the wake of learning how to work together, in Taichi's absence, new evolutionary tiers would be reached. And somewhere along the way, the other children would acknowledge that Taichi had imbued them with his own courage, and so gave them the ability to press on and work as a team, even if he wasn't physically there to guide them any longer.